Hello, good evening. Welcome to my hotel room here in Warsaw, Poland. Got in a bit late, but I've pulled up my chair to read the next couple of chapters of Mosquito to you. Hope you can see that all the way over there in the screen. However, we're going to move on to chapter 10. Hope you're following along so far. So let's go straight in. Chapter 10 of Mosquito. The drone of British planes, wrote one Danish resistance fighter, was proof of British might and determination to beat the common Nazi enemy. And on the night of 17th of August 1943, the RAF provided plenty of it. An aerial armada of nearly 600 bombers thrummed across Jutland, Funen and Rowland before turning south over the Baltic towards Germany. Their route was carefully chosen, designed to signal the passage of a massive Bomber Command raid towards Berlin. For much of the previous week, the Mosquitoes of 139 Squadron had trailed the same path across Denmark on their way to Berlin. Since early August, the squadron had launched raids against Duisburg and Dusseldorf before turning their attention to the big city. So when, just before midnight on the 17th, the Pathfinder Mosquitoes returned to Berlin for a fourth time, the German defences were ready for them, exactly as the RAF had planned it. Since Easter, Mosquito spy planes of a A-Flight 540 Squadron RAF based at RAF Lucas in Scotland had been combing a vast region of land and sea stretching from Stettin at the mouth of the Oder River to Bornholm, the Danish island that sat 15 miles off the southeastern tip of Sweden. The crews were not told what they were looking for, and so when orders came through to cover the whole of Bornholm, an island with an area of over 200 square miles, or worse, the larger German island of Rügen, it felt like offering an invitation to the Luftwaffe to shoot them down. Even though the unit's new Mosquito Mark 8s, with their two-stage supercharged Merlin 61 engines, enjoyed a speed advantage at altitude over the German fighters, flying straight and level in broad daylight back and forth along parallel tracks in the manner of someone mowing a lawn was asking for trouble. The risk demanded by their orders, noted Lucas' intelligence officer, shook us rigid. Only when, finally, and in strict confidence, he and the crews were given limited details of what it was they were hunting for, did he come to appreciate something of the almost incredible anxieties about the Peenemunde area. The first indication that Peenemunde posed a threat had arrived via the SIS station in Stockholm. While SOE had a responsibility for gathering intelligence in Denmark, the rest of Europe remained the preserve of the senior agency. And when, in December 1942, they recruited a Danish chemical engineer based in Berlin, they struck gold. Given the cryptonym Elgar, his work required regular travel between Germany, Sweden, Finland, and Romania. While he would go on to establish a network of around 20 agents of his own, smuggling reports to the Stockholm hidden inside barrels of acid, it was his own keen ear that first alerted the British when, at the Berlin Technical High School, he overheard the professor discussing the testing of a rocket capable of carrying a 5-ton warhead over a distance of 200 kilometers. 3 months later, a recorded conversation between two German generals captured in North Africa confirmed that a powerful missile was under development. Wait until next year, one had been told, when shown a prototype missile at a test site near Berlin, and the fun will start. On 23rd of June 1943, a single 540 Squadron Mosquito PR-8 returned from a 6-hour mission over the Baltic with a take that provided the final piece of an intelligence jigsaw being assembled since Elgar first pointed towards Peenemunde. Photographs of a fully assembled 40-foot-long rocket, attended by railway wagons carrying high-pressure vessels containing the missile's liquid fuel. The Germans had built the world's first long-range ballistic missile, a weapon they could christen the V2, and it was believed that, with an estimated range of 130 miles, the rocket could hit London from launch sites in northwest France. Less than a week later, on 29th of June, at a meeting of Churchill's War Cabinet in the command bunker beneath Whitehall, the decision was taken to send in Bomber Command on noted MI6's head of scientific intelligence, the heaviest possible scale. It was assigned the code name Operation Hydra. Forced to wait 6 weeks until the lengthening late summer nights provided the hours of darkness required, Bomber Harris pulled the trigger on the night of 17th of August 1943. Ahead of the main force of heavy bombers, Beaufighters and Mosquitoes stirred up the German night fighter force, dragging them west, while 8 139 Squadron Mosquitoes tacked across southern Denmark and the Baltic before coasting into Germany over Rostock. They continued to Berlin, each approaching the city from a different altitude and direction before dropping 3 500-pound bombs each. Where these landed was of absolutely no interest or importance. The only thing that mattered was the response the Mosquitoes provoked from the air defences in the German capital, and it was overwhelming. Over half an hour or so, 89 flak batteries fired nearly 12,000 rounds up to an altitude of 18,000 feet. Beyond that height, the task fell to the Luftwaffe. As many as 150 fighters had been scrambled ready to meet the main bomber stream when it arrived at its expected destination. One of the Mosquitoes, coned by spotlights and hit by flak, limped home to RAF Swanton Morley. Another was shot down by the Luftwaffe and its crew killed. By the time the last Mosquito left Berlin, every night fighter not already there was ordered urgently to join the city's defence. Half an hour later, at 0015 hours, the first bombs rained down unimpeded on the Peenemunde research facility. Over 100 miles to the south, the huge force of fighters braced to defend the capital found themselves in the wrong place at the wrong time and too short of fuel to do anything about it. Over the next 3/4 of an hour, nearly 600 Lancasters, Halifaxes and Stirlings pummeled the research establishment with close to 2,000 tons of high explosive and incendiary bombs. The rocket threat to Britain was pushed back by months. The raid had come at a cost, though, borne most of all by those crews over the target towards the end of the raid, when the Luftwaffe had had time to reorganise and respond. 40 bombers and their crews were lost. To try to ensure accuracy on what was the smallest target yet attacked by such a large force of heavies, Bomber Command had been sent in beneath an all but full moon, which presented an opportunity to use the raid as cover for a mission by the Moon Men of 138 and 161 squadrons, the two Bomber Command units based at RAF Tempsford in Bedfordshire, tasked with dropping men and material into occupied Europe. It was a rare example of harmony in the relationship between SOE and the RAF, who were more often at odds. The air marshals had always looked down their noses at the work done by SOE, the dropping of men dressed in civilian clothes for the purpose of attempting to kill members of the opposing forces. Charles Portal, the Chief of the Air Staff, sniffed is not an operation with which the Royal Air Force should be associated. And while he had a less hostile view of those he regarded as spies rather than assassins, he was still reluctant to spare aircraft from his primary aim of reducing German cities to rubble. His bombing offensive, he told SOE, was a gilt-edged investment. I cannot divert aircraft from certainty to a gamble which may be a goldmine or may be completely worthless. It was a view held at least as firmly by the head of Bomber Command itself. Arthur Harris was far more inclined to dragoon the Tempsford squadrons into making up the numbers for his showcase 1,000-bomber raids. Even their precious and completely unsuitable single-engine Westland Lysanders were more properly used for covertly inserting and extracting agents behind enemy lines, were loaded with a pair of 250-pound bombs and allocated targets. The organisation, as the RAF Special Duties Flight referred to itself in the earliest days, had from its inception been something of a Cinderella to Bomber Command's ugly sisters. It had enjoyed a peripatetic existence since its creation in August 1940, reporting first to Fighter Command, then Bomber Command. Before it was finally moved to RAF Tempsford, it was based at Newmarket Racecourse, where the ops room was hidden behind a door warning "Jockeys only." Once installed there, the slow but reliable twin-engine Armstrong Whitworth Whitleys that had been the mainstay of the squadron's long-range agent-dropping operation were gradually replaced by a fleet of modified Handley Page Halifax 4-engined heavies. By the time a single 138 Squadron Halifax B-2 detached itself from the Peenemunde bomber stream over Denmark to fly north to the drop zone in the north of Jutland, the special duties operation at RAF Tempsford had grown to be substantial. During any moon period, as many as 20 aircraft might fly east across occupied Europe to destinations in Norway, Denmark, Belgium, the Netherlands, France, Poland, Italy, Germany, and Czechoslovakia. The Moonmen's mission required a meticulous navigation over many hundreds of miles to rendezvous a location agreed in advance between SOE and the field by radio. To ensure that a resistance reception committee would be waiting, the BBC Danish service confirmed details of the flight in coded language prior to its departure. When the men on the ground heard the drone of the approaching aircraft, they shone torches into the sky to make their presence known to the RAF crew. Flying beneath a full moon made navigation across the continent possible, but it also exposed the low-flying SD crews to Luftwaffe night fighters like a beetle on a blanket. On the night of the 17th, however, the 138 Squadron Halifax escaped their attention and dropped her load of weapons and explosives near Madom Lake before turning for home. Their mission had not gone completely unnoticed, however, as the RAF bomber slipped away. The parachute canopy carrying one of the dropped stores containers caught the eye of a patrolling Junker 88 pilot. He called it in, and as a result, his otherwise disappointing mission turned out to have far-reaching consequences. A few thousand feet below the Luftwaffe night fighter, Second Lieutenant Paul Jensen was waiting to receive the containers once they hit the ground. Codenamed Chatter, Jensen had been enjoying a decent enough war so far. Still only 23, the former merchant seaman had impressed his instructors at the STS schools with his nimble mind and fearlessness. He was also, they noted in their report, very good indeed with explosives. He didn't just understand them, he liked them. After parachuting in with Fleming Moose, he'd been given the responsibility for coordinating the resistance on SOE's behalf in the town of Aalborg on the Jutland Peninsula. Tonight, as he and the other 9 members of the reception committee drove away, with the supplies dropped by the British safely stowed in the back of their truck, it seemed his luck was holding. The containers had landed only a mile west of the planned drop zone. As they drove towards Skoping, however, they were found by a truck full of German soldiers, one of a number of patrols sent out following the Junker 88 pilot's RT call. Jensen's driver stepped on it, but it was hopeless. The resistance vehicle, modified to run using a wood burner, was no match for Wehrmacht's petrol-driven machine. They raced through Aalborg, past the station, before Jensen ordered his driver to pull over near a forester's cottage on the outskirts, surrounded on 3 sides by dense woods. His men scrambled out of the truck while trying to direct covering fire towards the soldiers on their heels. The Germans shot back, and in the brief firefight that followed, 23-year-old bank clerk Eric Vangsted was shot and killed. As he tried to escape to the safety of the forest, building engineer Paul Sorensen sprained his foot and was arrested. The next day, at a hastily convened court-martial set up in Aalborg Primary School under new rules instigated by Hermann von Hanneken, he was sentenced to death. At his comrade's funeral, held in Aalborg 5 days later, a tenth of the city's 60,000-strong population packed the park across the road from Ansgar Church, where Vangsted was laid to rest. Elsewhere, local businesses and factories downed tools as a mark of respect and solidarity. Feeling the Danes' growing fury, the Germans positioned an armoured unit, gun batteries, and armed police across the city. Given the intensity of feeling, the result was inevitable enough. Anger spilled over into the harassment of German soldiers, rioting and exchanges of fire. 23 Danes were injured and 2 killed. While the tense, dangerous situation in Aalborg simmered and flared in the wake of the Peenemunde raid that had provided the catalyst in Denmark's easternmost outpost, the island of Bornholm, evidence emerged that Operation Hydra might not have been quite as effective a break on German weapons development as it had first been thought. Chapter 11. At 13:05 on 22nd of August, the police station in Nixo, a small town on the east coast of Bornholm, received a telephone call informing them that an unidentified aircraft had crashed in a turnip field near Bodilsker Church. The local police superintendent informed Lieutenant Commander Hasse Christiansen, the senior naval officer on the island. The pair arrived at the scene at 14:15, 15 minutes before representatives of the German armed forces. It was long enough to take photographs of the wreckage and draw a detailed sketch. The official police report, filed at 7:45 that evening, described the machine and its arrival in detail. It came in at high speed with a loud hiss. It bounced off a field over the main road, then hit a telephone line before finally coming to rest. Approximately 3 meters long, it was painted yellow and looked like a small aeroplane. The serial number V83 was painted in black on the tail. The Danes concluded that it was remote-controlled and lacking a propeller, powered by a rocket or jet engine. What they estimated to be 150 kilograms of concrete in the nose was probably ballast in lieu of a warhead. The next day, Christiansen sent copies of his sketch and photographs to the head of Danish naval intelligence in Copenhagen, who, after transferring them to microfilm, arranged for them to be spirited to Stockholm, along with information about the pilotless aircraft had arrived in Bornholm from the south-southwest. Before the end of the month, Churchill had reconvened his war cabinet to discuss what appeared to be a new threat from Peenemunde. While Operational Hydra may have destroyed accommodation blocks on the eastern side of the research complex, where the Wehrmacht were developing the V2, a smaller Luftwaffe establishment to the northwest had been left untouched. And it was here that Hitler's Air Force was perfecting a lower-tech rival to the Army's ballistic rocket, the V1, an unmanned, jet-powered flying bomb with a range of over 150 miles. The threat from which it was soon realized was more imminent than the V2. On the same day that Churchill's war cabinet was first forced to confront the prospect that as well as rockets they might also have to defend against a barrage of flying bombs, Hasse Christiansen was presented with a set of his own photos by a Wehrmacht colonel demanding an explanation. To try to ensure that, whatever happened, copies of the photographs made it into the hands of British intelligence, Christiansen had produced multiple sets that were then dispatched via different networks. The Gestapo had chanced upon one of these during a routine inspection aboard a ferry crossing between Denmark and Sweden. Over the weeks that followed, Christiansen was arrested, taken to Copenhagen, and tortured so badly with razor blades, burning cigarettes, and beatings that he would require 2 major operations to return him to health. His bravery, though, had helped alert Britain to a potentially devastating new threat, the defence against which would soon fall substantially on the shoulders of the Mosquito and her crews. While London braced itself in Copenhagen, Werner Best knew he was losing control when resistance fighter Paul Sorensen, arrested during the clash with the German soldiers on the night of the Peenemunde raid, was tried and killed by a firing squad. It was hoped that burying his body in Germany might prevent the violent civil unrest that had followed the funeral of his comrade Erich Wangsted, but it did little to quell the rising anger. In Odense, an assault on the Wehrmacht officer by a mob provoked a heavy-handed response, which in turn led to a general strike in the city. Further strikes and riots spread across the country. Barely a month after Himmler had endorsed the success of his light touch approach governing the country, Best's position was crumbling. In a desperate bid to avoid being forced to relinquish control to the military in the shape of his rival General von Henneken, Best wrote to Himmler once more. Claiming that Danish rebellion had been inspired by the successful Allied invasion of Sicily and the subsequent fall of the Mussolini in July, the plenipotentiary alerted the Reichsführer SS to the possibility that we must alter the way we administered Denmark. But as Best's Plan A unravelled, Plan B turned out to be that I continued to govern the country, and in order to facilitate that, he wanted to set up a sort of Praetorian Guard of his own, backed by Himmler and the SS, but answerable directly to him. With sufficient security forces under his control, he was sure he could guarantee the continued flow of Danish produce into Germany. Himmler might have supported it too, were it not for the fact that Hitler had been made aware that the glowing appraisal of Denmark's internal security that Himmler himself had presented in July was false. The day before Best sent his letter to the SS chief, a German military photographer had briefed Hitler on the state of the fortifications along Denmark's Atlantic coast. The Führer took the opportunity to ask directly about the security situation there. As a result, von Hanneken was ordered to provide his own report of Denmark's state of near-open revolt. The general seized his chance to detail his rival's failure. The following day, and unaware that he'd been outmaneuvered, Best was summoned to Berlin. On arrival at the Reich Chancellery, he was warned by his boss, Minister of Foreign Affairs Joachim von Ribbentrop, that the Führer is beside himself. At lunchtime on 24th of August, whilst Best was out of the country, a delivery boy cycled through the back entrance of the Forum Exhibition Hall in Frederiksberg, Copenhagen. Ahead of him, in the low-slung basket of his Long John cargo bike, was what appeared to be a case of Tuborg beer. The company's advertising made a virtue of the fact that its Pilsner lager was guaranteed free of chemicals. But on this occasion, it wasn't strictly true. Instead of beer, the case delivered by the boy contained 30 pounds of marzipan plastic explosive. The conversion of the Forum, Denmark's largest indoor arena, into a barracks was nearly complete, and that didn't sit happily with the resistance. Once the boy had left, two saboteurs, disguised as labourers returning from their lunch break, opened the Tuborg case and placed the charges around the building. The subsequent explosions and fire rendered the hall useless for the rest of the war, leaving nothing but the skeletal steel frame as a reminder to the Germans of an audacious attack carried out in broad daylight. The increasing destruction was also now a clear expression of the will of the people. A Gallup poll conducted in July recorded that as few as 1 in 5 of the Danish population objected to sabotage. It was a shift in attitude that Mogensfog, with the help of SOE's chief organizer Flemming Moos, was doing his very best to foment. Moos himself may have had to conceal himself behind an assumed identity, but Fogg saw the value in using his, and since the end of 1942, while living underground, he had used it on open letters and speeches. To use his real name lent dignity to the resistance. It was important, he felt, that members of the resistance were not all anonymous. Whatever the resistance was preparing, the Germans were themselves doing a decent enough job of hastening the end of the undemanding, fruitful and one-sided relationship with their northern neighbour all by themselves. Berated in Berlin for his disingenuousness and failure, Werner Best returned to Copenhagen on 27th of August carrying a pair of documents designed to trigger a state of emergency and the imposition of martial law. At 9 o'clock the next morning, he handed the two ultimatums to the Danish Prime Minister without comment. Erik Scavenius thought the usually self-possessed German seemed depressed and beaten. The first document targeted Odense in retaliation for the injuries to the German officer, demanding 1 million kroner in compensation, a citywide curfew, and the handing over of those responsible for the attack. The second was far more wide-ranging and draconian. It required countrywide prohibitions on strikes and public gatherings, a 7:30 p.m. curfew on restaurants, the surrender of guns and explosives, and the setting up of new express courts to hand out the death penalty to saboteurs and resistance fighters. The government of the Reich, he concluded, expects the Danish government's acceptance of the above-mentioned demands before 4 p.m. today. 5 hours later, Scavenius and his senior ministers met with the king to inform him that Parliament had unanimously agreed to reject the ultimatum. In tears, Christian, whose thinly concealed contempt for the invaders through the years of acquiescence had provided his country with a measure of self-respect accepted that the time had come to incur their wrath. Protecting Denmark from the worst excesses inflicted by the Nazis elsewhere in Europe, he acknowledged, has been a heavy duty loaded with responsibility. He thanked them for the work you have done for your king and for your country, while privately fearful about the consequences of the decision. With God's help, the king later wrote in his diary, we will also manage whatever is in store for the coming days. The telephone lines to Sweden were cut within an hour of Best receiving formal notice that the Danish government regrets that it cannot find it right to help carrying through these provisions. At 4 a.m. the next morning, Flemming Moose, hiding in a private maternity hospital, woke to the sound of gunfire and explosions from the direction of the harbour. A few weeks earlier, SOE's chief organiser had received an assurance from the head of the Danish Navy, Vice Admiral Wedel, that his sailors would avenge the humiliations of April 1940, when not a single shot had been fired in response to the German invasion, and 1942, when 6 motor torpedo boats had been handed over to the Kriegsmarine, with no more complaint than flags flown at half-mast. Now, as Wehrmacht's troops stormed the naval base, Wedel instructed the Navy to carry out their standing orders, codenamed Operation Safari. Ships at sea were to try to reach neutral Sweden, while those alongside were to be scuttled to deny them to the Germans. Within an hour of Wedel's order, 32 Danish ships had been sunk and another 50 small vessels disabled. 13 escaped to Sweden, while Wedel's biggest ship, the Niels Juel, was deliberately run aground when, while attempting to break out, she came under attack from Junker 87 Stukas. While Wedel was sacked for failing to carry out his instruction to surrender under protest, he won the respect of his German counterparts, who told him, we have both done our duty. On hearing news of the Navy's action, Moose noted with satisfaction that there are still Vikings in Denmark. Across the rest of the country, von Hanneken's forces seized control of infrastructure, while the Danish army, with only a handful of exceptions, surrendered their weapons and were interned in their barracks. As dawn broke, influential professionals thought to be hostile to the Reich were taken from their homes and detained. King Christian, meanwhile, was placed under virtual house arrest by German soldiers at Sorgenfrei Palace, his residence just north of the capital. His own royal guard was returned to his quarters and confined. Mogens Fogg looked out of the window to see a small German army truck pull up outside. After listening to radio reports of ultimatums, arrests, and the resignation of the government, played over a loudspeaker on the street below, he'd cancelled plans and met with the Frit Denmark colleagues to report on the day's events. And now they are here, he told the others, before stuffing his work behind a shelf of books and running downstairs to the courtyard they shared with the ground floor restaurant. He climbed into an empty bin and pulled the lid over his head. He felt that he'd been there a long time when he heard one of his colleagues repeating his alias in a low voice. Fogg pushed off the lid. Why are you sitting in there? His friend asked. The Germans had only stayed long enough to slap a poster on the gate before moving on. They spent the rest of the day editing until forced to finish early in order to get home before the new curfew. After Fogg cycled home, he switched on the radio to hear a speech he'd recorded and smuggled out of the country, broadcast over the BBC Danish service. The announcer had made his situation sound bleak. Mogens Fogg, who lives hidden underground in occupied Denmark, but as he looked out across the sea from his fifth-floor apartment in the late summer twilight, his spirits lifted. No sense at all, he smiled, of feeling hunted or being in hiding. His own voice followed, urging action. Is it enough for you to gather for a discussion of future problems that cannot be solved until freedom is won? He asked his audience. Are you happy to keep your hands in your pockets? Join the movements that are actively fighting Nazism. And he thought, I wonder how many people are listening to the BBC Danish service this evening. This was now a new war in Denmark. Baker Street took what credit it could, informing Churchill that sabotage activities organised by SOE have been partly responsible for recent political events in Denmark, a point likely to have been well appreciated by the Prime Minister. The acceleration of violence in Denmark may have cost 2 young freedom fighters their lives, but it was a necessary and worthy sacrifice. Just weeks earlier, Churchill had reminded the Cabinet Defence Committee that the blood of martyrs is the seed of the Church. Consumed with self-pity, Werner Best lashed out at the Danish press for his predicament. In this ridiculous little country, he told journalists, the press implanted the idea that Germany is weak. Last night you got your reward, but Best was also shrewd enough to realise that the tide was turning. Now, facing the combined might of the Allies to the west, south and east, Germany's strength no longer seemed unassailable nor victory assured. The previous weeks had seen thousands of desperate Germans trying to cross the border into Denmark to escape the destruction being meted out by the RAF. Monica Wichtfeld was no stranger to being outside in the small hours of the morning. Since agreeing to put Engerstofte at the disposal of the resistance, she'd grown used to slipping out of the house after her husband had gone to sleep to row across the lake in a small boat, carrying explosives from the main house to another hideaway. She told Jürgen that the calluses on her hands were down to the difficulty of getting hold of decent skincare products. Tonight was different, though. As she stood, cigarette in hand, looking southwest across Maribor Lake, Monica could see the distant sky glowing thousands of feet into the air over Germany. She'd heard the low thrum of the British bombers that night. Now she could see something of the devastation they were inflicted with her own eyes. But there was something else. For the first time, the grounds of the house had been showered with thin, 10-inch long blackened aluminium strips. She picked one up from the lawn and rubbed it between her fingers. It had come from the sky. It seemed obvious that it was in some way connected to the air raid. Its purpose, however, and that of the 92 million other tinfoil strips dropped that night, was entirely unknown to her. And that is the end of chapter 11. Chapter 12 will be on a different reading, but hopefully you're enjoying listening to me read Mosquito. Please do share the videos with your friends. Please do subscribe to my channel, and I do hope you're enjoying everything so far. So, from Warsaw in Poland this evening, have a very good night and see you in chapter 12. Thank you.